true masculinity, or however you want to defend that, is just being able to be comfortable with everything, really. The good stuff, the difficult stuff, the highs, the lows. I mean, I think true masculinity is if you can hold on to all of that unapologetically. You can be taught 100 techniques, but if you're still being an arsehole to yourself, the techniques don't matter.
Owen O'Kane, thank you for joining me, mate.
Thanks for having me.
You are, by way of sort of biography here, and I'm going to embarrass you a bit, you're a distinguished psychotherapist and author. You're renowned for your accessible approach to mental health, really grounding your work with actionable practices for the public in your books that we were discussing earlier, 10 Times Happier, 10 to Zen, and now Addicted to Anxiety. Before we start proper, I wondered if you could give us a little bit more of your bio, a little bit more of your professional background.
I mean, thanks for having me, and it's good actually to be on a men's platform as well, talking about men's health and stuff, because I do think this is a massively important subject. But in a nutshell, I'm a psychotherapist by background. That's my key job. I end up, over the last 5 years, I've done a lot of books. This is book number 4, and I do try and write, as you rightly said, in a way that people will get and understand. But prior to that, I was a clinical lead in the NHS, so I was running a large mental health team before then moving into the kind of the platforms that I do now. And then prior to that, worked in palliative care. So I work with people who were terminally ill. Did that for about 10 years. And then before that, did accident and emergency. So I kind of started off in the kind of more dramatic end of stuff, then moved into palliative care. And that was an incredibly difficult 10 years, but really good experience. And then went off into more mainstream common mental health, anxiety, depression, trauma, started working in that. And then if I kind of go back way before that, grew up in Northern Ireland, in Belfast during what is known as the Troubles. So I guess if I'm talking about my work, I kind of try to operate from 3 parameters really. So operate from the professional training as a therapist. I try to include my story and my background, which wasn't easy, but I do think it informed how I work. And then, of course, working with people who are dying for 10 years really keeps your feet on the ground in terms of what's important. So if I write or I'm talking, it's always with kind of 3 heads on: my story, my experience, and my professional training.
This has just occurred to me actually when we were chatting outside, but I wonder if you could really quickly tell me, because there's such a sort of plethora of different approaches or hats in this arena. I wonder if you could briefly describe for our audience what a psychotherapist is and how that's different from maybe other counseling modalities.
I should say not a psycho. people often hear the word psycho and think, yeah, that's a good start. I mean, there are loads of different types of therapies. I'm trained in different models of therapy. So I've done some kind of broader psychodynamic training, and that's kind of more interested in the relationship and how we are as people. So it kind of digs a bit deeper. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which I did my master's in, is very interested in the relationship between the way we think and how that impacts the emotional state. EMDR is another model of therapy I'm trained in, and that's a trauma model where we use rapid eye movement therapy to treat trauma. So it's very popular with people who have been in the military or had really significant trauma. More generic counselling tends to be more of a conversation and more really, I mean, all therapies are relational. In my experience, that if you don't build a relationship with a client, you're screwed. So I think you're halfway there. I think if you build up a good rapport and a good trust with a client, then you can do some work. If you haven't got that, then I think you're generally wasting your time. But some therapies can be more open-ended, where they're just kind of, they will just flow and they will just go in the direction of the client. I personally believe that the danger with that, and this is not a criticism of any other therapy models, but I think most people need some degree of direction. And I think when I work with people, I tend to work in a time-focused way, where I'll maybe do a block of 12, 16 sessions with them. And I think when people know that they have a block of time, they'll work harder, as opposed to if I said, okay, come for the next 3 years and talk about whatever you want. I mean, what therapy isn't, it's not like people think it's a nice cup of tea and a chat, and it's actually not. Therapy is a overhaul of your life, how you think, the way you deal with emotions, your behaviours, the people you have in your life, what's working for you, what's not working for you, how you're living day to day. So it's like a massive transformation, You know, anybody who, if you go to therapy and you're having a nice time, you're in the wrong therapy. Is my experience.
So it should be challenging.
Yeah, look, it shouldn't be, you know, it shouldn't be horrible. You shouldn't go there and think I'm having a shit time and I'm not enjoying it. But actually, if you're not confronted with difficulties or you're not confronted with challenges, then you're probably not in the right place. It's like holding up a mirror, really. Good therapy will present all of you, but it will also present stuff that's harder to look at.
Yeah, and presumably how to work with that.
And you know, Jung would have called it the shadow stuff, and we all need to go there. We all have the darker stuff, and most people try and push it down and get rid of it, whereas actually that's often where we need to go.
Just to close this topic quickly, and again, this only came to me when we were just chatting up. So let's talk about something else. Yeah, what should people look out for in a good therapist? Because as we were sort of saying outside, that there's so much advice. This is a strange thing to say, but it's such a growth industry, right? There's so much advice now permeating the airwaves on, you know, social media. What should people look out for to kind of, and this is something I think about in fitness and health in general, to ensure that they're getting good information?
I think there's a lot of stuff online that is well-meaning and well-intended, but not coming from evidence. It's not coming from research. It's just coming from well-intended values. But take anxiety, for example. People will often give, my gym I go to, about a year ago, I went in one day, and one of the personal trainers at the gym, who's got a real interest in mental health, he had a list on the board for every week he would have a tip, and his tips were on anxiety that particular week. And the 5 tips he had for anxiety would have maintained anxiety with somebody. They all went against the clinical evidence for managing anxiety. Now you read them and you think, oh, they sound lovely and they sound quite comforting, but actually they would have made somebody more anxious longer term. So I think that's what we need to be mindful of. I think if you're going for a therapist, check that they are qualified, that they have accreditation with the regulatory body. We're all regulated, so make sure it's not enough really just to have someone who's done training. You want to check that they're fully trained, qualified, and have full accreditation with their regulatory body. Go on a recommendation and meet the therapist as well. There's no point. If you were my therapist and I met you and I thought, oh, I don't like this guy, or he's too fluffy for me, or I don't like his approach, or I'm not going to get on with him, then it's probably not going to work. So I think you meet somebody and you get a sense of who they are, whether you're going to relate to them and whether you trust them and whether you can relax around them. But you know when you're with them. I mean, I've had brilliant therapy. We have to in my job. And I've had very not so brilliant therapy. But you know very, very quickly what's going to work for you. Sometimes it is about that, just finding a good match. So if you've got a mate who's been to a therapist and you trust their opinion, recommendations are helpful as well.
Pithy sounding platitudes is what I refer to them as. It sounds really nice, and when something sounds nice is when it's most insidious, isn't it? When it's well-meaning, there's something worse than a well-meaning platitude.
Well, all of these tips that this guy gave for managing anxiety. So one of them was if you need to stay in bed, you stay in bed. If you need assurance, make sure you get assurance from people that are there to help you, that are there to support you. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. So with anxiety, for example, you know, people will want to avoid situations. So therapeutically, you're bringing them towards that they're frightened of, not in a way that you're going to overwhelm them. So you wouldn't be reinforcing avoidance with somebody because you're actually going to maintain their anxiety longer term. You wouldn't be saying to someone, stay in bed all day, because it becomes another means of avoidance. You wouldn't be saying to someone, reassurance seek as much as you need to, because that's going to make you feel better, because one of the maintenance for anxiety is reassurance seeking. So, I mean, they're just a couple of examples, but he was given tips that would maintain anxiety for somebody. It wouldn't help them shorter term. So, I mean, it's just one example, but there are thousands out there where people really mean well, but actually it's counterintuitive to what's actually going to help.
Do you think this is a danger in general of scaling information? I think it's often about social media. Like there's this, everything's relational, right? And some things are going to land in it. But I mean, a lot of them that you mentioned there, I can't really see how they would be good advice. But
they came across because they're quite soft and they're quite warm. So it's like, and if you're having a tough day and someone's got on a board, it's okay, just go back to bed. Get all the reassurance that you need from someone. Then that's going to feel shorter term, quite comforting.
Yeah.
So very often that kind of shorter term comforting thing is what most people will opt for in anxiety, when actually longer term is going to create a problem, because actually anxiety does involve a certain degree of discomfort. And the more you can go towards the discomfort, the more you're going to find breakthroughs. But of course, people will think, I just want to hide away. I just want to get rid of this as quickly as possible. But unfortunately, that maintains it. So I think a lot of the advice we're given is well-meaning. And I think sometimes it comes from experience rather than professional training or evidence. So,
Yeah.
you know, like if you and I went through a difficult time in our life, your experience of it and mine would be entirely different.
Yeah.
So what I would be telling you to do because it helped me doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be right for you. And I think there's also as well, and I think this is a positive, when people have been through a tough time, they might want to share with everyone that they've recovered and they're doing well. And that's incredible because it can be hopeful and people think, oh, this is amazing. But when you've got millions of people out there doing that, and when you've got a lot of people who have turned mental health into a brand, let's be honest about it, it has become that, and it's become clickbait. I've always had a problem with that because, you know, when you're working with people, as I've done in my career, who have got significant difficulties, there's nothing cool about this. It's not fun.
No.
You know, it's not a hashtag. It's not a clickbait, you know. If someone's got debilitating anxiety, it's going to really get in the way of their life. And I think there's a danger that at one level we've got conversations that have opened up, incredible. But I also think there's a danger that the conversations now, people are becoming a bit cynical about it. There's a bit of eye rolling going on. There's a bit, I think it's almost got diluted to your point where people can't really differentiate anymore between what's a bad day and what's a mental health issue.
Yeah.
Because everything's just got merged into one.
Yeah, I mean, there was a study fairly recently, wasn't there, about broad awareness of mental health symptoms can actually increase.
Yeah.
You know, it's we look for we're pattern seeking animals.
And a bad day isn't a mental health problem. I mean, a bad day, like personally for me, and this is just my opinion, I'm not a massive fan of over pathologizing people or over labeling them. I do sometimes think it's helpful. There are moments when a diagnosis can be really useful. It can get them the right support, the right help, the right medication should they need it. But then there are other times I think to be a human being means sometimes your anxiety might go up, sometimes your mood might drop, sometimes your motivation might drop, sometimes you might feel angry, you're not sleeping well, you're not eating well, everything just feels shit, frankly. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a significant mental health. I don't like the word disorder, but this is what we call it. It doesn't mean that you have a significant mental health disorder. It may mean that you need to start making some adjustments and tweaks with your life. But I guess for me, rather than label it as an abnormality, I think, well, it's part of the human condition to struggle and to have the kind of ups and downs as part of being human. So I'm much more interested in the conversation about to be human is to struggle. And can we just focus on that rather than getting too carried away with needing to put a label on everything?
Yeah. Let's talk about the book. You describe anxiety as something people can become addicted to. Can you tell me what you mean by that and how that works? Because I don't think it's something that intuitively addiction and anxiety.
It's never been done, and I was very aware that the title would call. I mean, look, thankfully the book's landed brilliantly and people are getting it and it's proven popular, and I'm happy about that because that was the goal of doing it. But I guess really a long and short story behind the book was I was running a group in the NHS at the time for about 16 people who were chronically anxious. So they'd had loads of treatments, they'd done loads of programs and they weren't recovering. And a psychiatrist I was working with at the time said to me, I want you to set up a group, see what you can do with them. And I noticed about 8 weeks into the treatment program, they were all starting to improve and do better. So, you know, me thinking I was doing the right thing, I said to them, God, I noticed you're all starting to improve. There was banter in the room. The atmosphere was lighter. And the moment I pointed out they'd improved, the room went quiet. And this one guy then piped up, and he had been a previous drug addict. And he then said, bloody hell, I thought it was hard giving up coke. He said, this is a nightmare. He said, because if I let go of my anxiety, he said, that makes me feel a bit frightened. And then everyone in the group laughed. But it was interesting. They all got what he meant, that to let go of the anxiety felt a bit threatening. And then I remember thinking there's an addictive component to this. So I'm not saying that anxiety in itself is an addiction, but I think the process of anxiety can be addictive because the promise is it's going to keep you safe. So we can get addicted to the ways of thinking. We can get addicted to the emotions that come with it. we can get addicted to the behaviors that are normally about trying to get rid of the feeling. I mean, and that's the kind of the contradiction, because people hate feeling anxious. They will do anything to get rid of it. But then if you speak to any addict, they will take or use whatever they have, but then they'll hate themselves afterwards for doing it. So there's always this kind of love-hate. And I think with anxiety, people don't want to feel the discomfort of it. But then the minute you try and take them away from it, they resist. Because why would you let go of something that you think, well, what would happen if I stopped worrying? I had a client say to me a few weeks ago, she's doing really well. And she came in and she said, God, things are really good. And I said, amazing. And she said, just one thing happened to me the other day. I woke up and for the first time I didn't have a knot in my stomach. And I said, great. And she went, well, I was a bit worried. And I said, oh, what were you worried about? She said, I was worried that I didn't have the knot in my stomach because that meant maybe something could go wrong. So it's that kind of vigilant, when we're anxious, we're kind of hypervigilant, we're on guard, we're on watch. And I think that's the thing that people don't realize. Unconsciously, we've become quite dependent on the fact, should I be watching out for that? Could that be a problem? Will this go wrong? What if I don't look out for that? What if I start worrying? So I realized we get very, very addicted to the process of anxiety. So, and that's why I'd done the book. I thought, I'm not going to do a fluffy, heal your anxiety in a day bullshit. I wasn't going to do anything that I didn't believe in. And I think with anxiety, we contribute more to your anxiety than we realize. And I know that's really hard to hear, but actually a lot of our own behaviors maintain the anxiety. So I didn't want to just create a book that was just like, read this book and you're cured forever.
Yeah.
You're always going to have anxiety, at some level, because you're meant to. But the key thing for me is that if you see anxiety as a negative in your life, then that's exactly what it becomes. It becomes quite toxic. Whereas I talk a lot in the book about building a new relationship with your anxiety, getting to know it, work with it as a sort of helpful ally rather than an enemy. That can be, astronomically life-changing.
Yeah, that recognizing the part we play in our own suffering is a bitter pill to swallow, isn't it?
Really hard.
Can you, well, I know you can, but just define anxiety for me.
The textbooks, a clinical definition would say it's an intolerance of uncertainty. So you get a big, massive clue there. So the intolerance. So like if we think that we need to know, or we have to know, or there has to be predictability, or we have to be in control, then we're going to struggle. Because the reality is we're not in control. The reality is often we don't know. And the reality is often we have no clue what is going to come next, how people are going to behave. Whatever industry we work in, we don't often know what way it's going to go. So the reality is we live in a really uncertain world, and that's how it's meant to be, and that's how it's always going to be. But I think as human beings, we've become more primarily hardwired to try and control it. So if I'm working with anyone anxious, do they like control? Absolutely. Do they try and take control? Absolutely. Do they believe that they shouldn't be feeling anxious? Yep. Do they believe that things should be more predictable, things should be better than they are, that the reason they're anxious is because of life and everybody else? Like every client I meet, that's exactly what you're up against. Whereas I guess my work goes the other way, because every variable that the client will give you, I'm anxious because of my mum, my dad, my husband, my wife, my job, my boss, my career, where I live. Most of that you can't really change immediately. So why would I waste time trying to change stuff that we know? Well, actually, that's, if your husband's pissing you off, that's probably not going to change anytime soon. So it's kind of going in more a bit more on changing the internal landscape in terms of how you respond.
What does that look like?
I think it's a massive question, but it's about, firstly, how your perspective on your anxiety is key. So how do you view your anxiety? Most people get tied up in the feeling, so they become the anxiety. So most people say, I'm anxious. And I'd say, well, actually, you're not. You're aware that you're anxious, but it doesn't define you. So you're kind of helping people see that they don't have to get tangled up in it, that they don't need to become entrenched in it, that they aren't the thought. And that's such a massive thing, that you're not the anxious. That thought that this is terrible, this is awful, this is going to go wrong, that's not a fact. Or if it's a more critical voice saying you're rubbish, you're not good enough, you're a failure, you're too fat, you're too skinny, you should have done better. Again, none of that's factual. It's just scripts that play out over and over and over again. But again, that's quite addictive because the human personality will go to that content
Yeah.
and it will almost kind of want to get more. And of course, the more you engage with it, the more you feed it.
Yeah. I think it's such a incredible thing that we're never taught from a young age is that exactly as you just said, thoughts are real, but they're not really real. They're just thoughts, right? They are what they are, and they're not you. And I think until someone actually tells you that, most people don't even know they're thinking, right? Most people are just, they think that experience is them.
Well, I mean, for most people, you've got about 80,000 thoughts a day on average. So the neuroscientists can measure how many thoughts we have. And we know that about 70% can be either critical, anxiety-driven, or self-deprecating. So like most people, if you're able to get inside their mind, what you've got a lot of darker, negative, critical thoughts going on. And the problem with that is that if people engage with that and they take it seriously, and this is particularly for men, because I don't want to generalize too much, but females are much better at having these conversations. Females are much better at kind of externalize, and they'll recognize that they're thinking a particular thing or they've got a difficult emotion, and they're much, much better at bringing that out into the open. Whereas by and large, guys tend to shut that down and they tend not to reveal the content. So of course, then they believe that they're the only one thinking that, and that to share that with somebody else would be unimaginable because they would be judged or criticized, or they would be seen as weak or too vulnerable. So I think men particularly store all this stuff up.
Yeah.
And it doesn't be brought out into the open. So we got a lot of, I think I see this every day in my clinical work. If I'm working with men particularly, getting them to go towards this content at the beginning can be really hard.
Yeah.
Because there's a massive amount of shame around. Shame is something that we don't talk about either. That a lot of men carry lots of shame about what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and believing that they should be stronger than they are. And my definition of strength is probably very different to a lot of your guests, because men's health is often about strength and physical strength, and whereas my take is that the real strength really is the strength that's here.
If you're enjoying this content, you can watch or listen ad-free on the Men's Health app by joining the Men's Health Squad today. Head over to hearstmagazines.co.uk/mh-mag. Once you're in the squad, you'll also have access to tons of exclusive content, including interviews, ad-free videos, and our world-class training platform, which features dozens of training plans to suit every level and any goal. Something we spoke about outside is, as you say, like, pushing some men towards this content is difficult, and there are a lot of men that feel shame towards opening up about these sorts of things. Could you just address if there are any historical realities to the reasons why we wouldn't? Are there genuine consequences, or have there been genuine consequences for men expressing these feelings that they probably conceptualize as weakness, not being as strong as they think, that are real? What I'm kind of thinking is the men aren't a monolith. We all have different educational backgrounds, different experiences. We're all at different places in our lives, economically, etc. And there are some parts of culture where you actually can't. So, not that you can't talk about these things, but there are real consequences. I wondered if you could speak to that, because I just know that a lot of those men that struggle to approach this content, it is because of realities in their life, if that makes sense, their peer group or whatever.
I get it. I mean, look, probably the best way I can answer that question was, and I kind of alluded to this when we were talking before we started recording, was I did an event about a year ago, and it was for the motor industry, and it was 500 blokes in the room, and they had said to me before I came to do the event that this is going to be a tough audience. They've never had this sort of talk before. They're probably going to think a lot of it's bullshit, and there's going to be a lot of eye rolling and cynicism about the subject matter. Look, I mean, I've been around the block, so I'm not frightened of a challenge. So I went along, and before I went in, before I went on stage, there was an American guy who was basically there to tell them that they were all doing a really rubbish job and the Americans were doing it better. So it was actually the perfect warm-up.
Yeah, good opener. Yeah.
Before I went on. So I thought, whatever happens, it can't go as badly as this guy's talk. But I get into the room and it was really interesting. As a therapist, you're always listening to your instinct. And it doesn't matter where I work or what I'm doing, is I'll pick up on the energy and I'll pick up on the energy, but I'll pick up on what's going on in the room very, very quickly. And it was interesting. I went into this room and these 500 guys were there. When I say 500, it was 94% male, 6% female, but it was, it was a majority male audience. And when I went into the room, I was immediately struck by like this sense of hunger in the room. It's a really interesting feeling. And I wasn't getting the resistance that I sort of was expecting when I went in. And they were there and they were more engaged than I thought they would be. And I kind of made the decision immediately that I wasn't going to, I will always kind of change my talk anyway. I'll have an idea. But when I started talking, I thought, I'm not going to go too clinical. I'm not going to go heavy on psychobabble or any of the cliches or any of that stuff, because I just know it will go down like a lead balloon. And when I started to talk, I kind of said, look, is anybody in the room, does this make any sense to you? Does anyone ever wake at 3 a.m, not able to sleep, head on overdrive? And almost every one of them put their hand up. I said, does anyone ever have a day where they wake up and they just can't be bothered? All put their hand up. Does anyone ever have a day where they just feel like there's just too many worries? And it feels like there's a lot of questions, a lot of what if, what if, what if. Again, everyone in the room puts their hand up. Does anyone ever have a day where they feel like their motivation drops, where they're angry, where they're taking it out on their other half or their kids? So it was just a sea of hands going up, like it was the majority of people in the room. And then I was able to break it down and say, that's mental health. This is a conversation. These are the symptoms of, these kind of hashtag mental health or mental well-being or however you want to phrase it. So it was a humanity of struggle that actually, immediately was like there's barely a person in this room who hasn't struggled with a symptom. And I kind of think for me, that is probably one of the most important things, that the consequence of not talking is that you can end up just becoming exhausted or burnt out or unwell. Because, there's a big clue. The word depression and repression are very, very closely linked. So, you repress and do you become depressed? And it's a big potential that if you hold down too much stuff, or you're not connecting, or you're not bringing this stuff out into the light in some way, shape or form. So the power in that group was that they were all acknowledging that sometimes they're not finding it easy. And then suddenly it didn't feel like an abnormality. It didn't feel like a judgment. It didn't feel like they'd had a label slapped on them. And then, of course, I went ahead, delivered the talk, did a really good workshop. They really got involved. There's 500 of them, but they were interacting. But the fascinating thing for me is, and I've been around the block and I've done a lot of talks and conferences and keynotes and stuff in my life. It was a big auditorium. It was up in the NEC in Birmingham. And at the end of the talk, there was a line from the stage to the end of the room with people queuing up to ask a question or to make a comment. And that really, really struck me, that in an audience I was kind of briefed would be difficult because it was mostly men and they wouldn't be interested. It was probably the hungriest audience that I spoke to. And I could give you a dozen more examples of that there. I think we need to get, and I know this conversation goes on, again and again and again about how do we encourage men to speak. It's not just about speaking. That's only one part of it. Yeah. But I think it's just about how do we realistically help men to understand that this is really part of being human, and that this story and this narrative about weakness and vulnerability, and that it demasculizing you in some way, it really is a myth, and it's actually quite a dangerous one.
Yeah.
Because I believe that, true masculinity, or however you want to defend that, is just being able to be comfortable with everything, really. The good stuff, the difficult stuff, the highs, the lows. I think true masculinity is if you can hold on to all of that unapologetically, as opposed to believing, you've got to be the alpha, you've got to be strong, you've got to be fit, you've got to be together. That is just not possible. We're not wired that way. The human condition cannot be in a infinite state of eliteness all of the time. Just can't be, because if we were, then we wouldn't grow, we wouldn't develop, we wouldn't learn, we wouldn't evolve. So I think that kind of, old dated belief that this is how it needs to be is rubbish. We're a mixed bag of everything.
What do you think you did differently in that auditorium? As you said, you made the decision to sort of tailor it to this audience. What was it about that initial approach of just asking those questions that you think was maybe different to how more public-facing mental health content is, how people might talk on social media, the message as it's being presented. What do you think was different about
I
what
think
you do?
I think it has to be, for me, it has to be the humanity. That's always got to be the number one for me, the humanity, the conversation. And also as well, I think there is a danger. I mean, I go to conferences and talks all the time, and I think there is a danger that sometimes speakers believe that they have to go on as a guru or the expert. And I kind of think, like we the people in my world, therapists, well-being speakers, that, we're also human beings who have moments and have difficulties. And I guess I will always tell a bit of my own story. And I'll never go on there claiming to be the all-knowing expert or believing that I'm the person who's got all of the answers. I think you've got to be, if you're getting involved with people in their life, I think you also have to be willing to give a bit of your own story. And, my story, isn't and wasn't easy, and it's very working class, difficult roots, but in a climate of a lot of anxiety and fear in Northern Ireland during the Troubles and during that period. And I think the minute you're willing to bring your own humanity to the table and say, look, I get this. I get anxiety. I understand it. I get struggle. I get what it's like to not feel together all the time, because that is all of us. Like, that is every single one of us. But I'm not going to pretend that I do have it together all the time. And I think you have to be willing to do that. Have to be. Otherwise, you shouldn't be using the platforms.
Do you think we need more people from greater backgrounds being open about these things?
I mean, look, I guess I think we need to pretend less, and I think that is the key thing for me. And I get, one of the things about getting older, I'm in my 50s now, and I guess one of the things about getting older is that you do realize, and particularly when you've worked with hundreds of people and you've been around the block and you've seen it and you've done it, and you kind of get a real flavor of what works and what doesn't work. But I guess as well, working with people, when I was working with people who were dying for those 10 years, you get a massive wake-up call about being honest and not wasting time and being as true as you potentially can be. And I guess I've arrived at that point in my life where I don't really feel I've got anything to prove. And I don't want that to sound arrogant, but I've had a good career. I don't feel like I'm out to prove anything. I'm just out to talk about what I know to be true based on genuine personal and professional experience. And I think there's a danger that so much time is wasted. So I guess I just go out there and I kind of think, well, this is what I see, this is what I know. And I think a lot of it's pretty true. And if people are willing to hear it and take it on board, then I think a lot of it can be quite helpful.
You said something interesting there about being true, about, let's be expedient, let's not waste time, let's be true to ourselves. How do we balance that with kind of not falling into traps? Just to circle back to that signpost with all those really sort of alluring mental health sort of platitudes. Yeah. How do we balance this idea of being true and living in an authentic manner, but without just doing kind of going wherever our fears and desires take us and falling into that trap? How do we sort of do that dance?
I mean, look, it's a big question again, but I think there's a brilliant expression that the way out is in. And I think most of what's out there will tell us, very, very clearly, you're going to be happier when you're this, or when you do that, or when you achieve that, or when you earn that, or when you look like this. I mean, I think that's fair to say that's the general message that goes on with most of media, social media. Most platforms talk about, the external stuff will sort out your internal stuff. And I guess when you work in my world, what you discover is most struggle for every one of us really is about what goes on inside, really. How people think about themselves, how people see themselves. I mean, look, most people would never speak to another human being the way they speak to themselves. And I guess when you do my job, you get that privilege of getting inside people's heads and what's going on for them. So most people do a lot of self-attacking. Most people do give themselves an incredibly difficult time. Most people are clinging on to the past. Most people are terrified of what's coming next. And most people are desperately trying to control all of their life, believing that if they do, it will sort out the internal stuff.
Yeah.
And in my experience, I've never seen it work once for anyone. And I see a lot of people, and I get to see a broad spectrum of life, and I have seen a broad spectrum of life in my career. And what I've worked out is that the external stuff, I've never, ever once seen it work properly. Yeah, I've seen it like, if you've got a bit more money, of course, it's going to make life a bit easier. You get a nice car and you feel good for a week. Then you start looking something different. You get the relationship that you think is going to make you happy, and then 2 weeks later you realize they've got bad breath, and you know that they're not perfect, or they say things that you don't like. We're constantly believing that the kind of the perfection is going to make us happy. Whereas for me, if I'm working with somebody, I'll go to the, well, how are you feeling about all of this stuff? And so I kind of go a different direction. So you're going inward.
Yeah, I often think the sort of ability to project, imagine a better future is our biggest gift and our greatest curse, right?
Yeah.
Because then we're stuck in that. If only, if only, if only.
Well, I'm fascinated by the whole, there's some stuff out there on manifesting and stuff, and I believe there's some good stuff on it out there. And, I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting a better life, But I often think it's also about be careful what you manifest, because for me, the bigger question is always, okay, well, why would you want that? If you believe that in a year's time you're going to have X, Y, and Z, tell me why you think that's going to make you happier. And that's always a really interesting question, because you then get to why they think it will validate them, or why they'll feel better about themselves, or why they'll prove themselves. And that's what most of us are doing. Like, I think the reality is most of us crash land into adulthood. Yeah. And we haven't really been taught what to do. We don't really know what to do with all of that stuff. And if you've crash landed into adulthood and you were told that you're not good enough, or that you're a failure, or you should have been this, you should have done better, whatever the context might be, if you haven't ever dealt with that stuff, it just comes along with you. So you just end up spending all your adult life trying to deal with all of this stuff that's just been carried along into adulthood with you, never dealt with, never processed in any way, shape, or form. So we just end up spending our adult lives trying to undo the stuff that happened in childhood.
Yeah.
That our parents or social backgrounds, or being bullied at school, or being rejected or left out. Most of the time when you're working with people, they're trying to heal that damage, but by never going near it.
Yeah. We carry so many unquestioned beliefs.
Yeah.
And if even if we're not trying to deal with it, it's still there, right?
Yeah.
I think an interesting turnaround point for me was when I realized that as sort of dark and dim as all that sounds, it is your brain's, your nervous system's job to do that, right? There's nothing defective about you because you've got a sort of critical inner monologue, or you're looking out for danger. That's literally what it's designed to do.
I don't see it as dark or dim. What I see it as is the minute you realize that, then you're in control.
Yeah.
That's where the real
freedom there.
Yeah, that's where the real power comes. I mean, if you get a bit more scientific about it, we think about our neural pathways, these pathways that form how we respond, how we act, how we behave. And I think if you simplify them, it's kind of like A to B. You've got a pathway that goes from A to B. And depending on your experience or my experience, our pathways will have been, kind of hardwired differently. Now, some of these pathways may not be that great, and they may create difficulties in our lives. But the good news is actually you can rewire those pathways. Now, it doesn't mean that you ever get rid of the original pathway. It's always going to be there, but you can learn to create new patterns, new behaviors, new responses that mean that you can almost build a bridge over it. It's like a bypass.
Yeah.
So you can learn to kind of think, oh, that doesn't work for me anymore. And like if you think of anxiety, for example, in my own life, anxiety was a really useful thing. So when I grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, back then, anxiety was a really helpful thing, because you needed to have it to survive there. For most people who grew up in that period, anxiety was useful because it helped you survive. So my neural pathways that were hardwired to be on guard and to be on alert all of the time, that was actually how it was meant to be, because it was needed at that time. Now, for some people, they might be hardwired in a way that's not needed, but actually that's the card they've been dealt. But I then kind of get into adulthood and I realize, okay, my anxiety is way higher than it needs to be, because I'm not in that situation anymore, and that level of threat. So I guess what you're doing is you're evaluating, okay, does this work for me anymore? Do I need to carry that pattern with me? Is there another way forward? And I think that's, look, for me, the exciting part of my job is for anybody struggling out there, whether it be with anxiety, mood, trauma, motivation, how they feel about themselves, there is always a way forward. And there's so much that you can do that changes that quite dramatically, to be honest. But you've kind of got to get to that point where you think, right, I've really had enough.
Yeah.
I don't want to feel this way anymore. I don't want to live this way anymore. I want to do things differently. And I think when people get to that point, it's a brilliant place to be because you can do a lot with it.
We mentioned, well, we spoke about previously this idea, and I guess it goes to the point you were making in that auditorium in the NEC, that a lot of men actually don't realize they're anxious. They wouldn't actually language it that way.
I did this in my own therapy. When I went to my first therapist in my early 20s, I went into that and did a lot of bullshitting, believing I was totally sorted. I didn't need it. I mean, I was there for a reason, but even in the process, I was trying to fool the therapist that I was okay. And I didn't really have access to the language at that time, but I think you're spot on because I think a lot of people do that. They think, oh, that's not for me. Like I said to you, a mate of mine has just finished reading the book at the minute, and he rang me up and he said, bloody hell, I said, I wouldn't have said I was anxious before, but I've read that and I realise all of those chapters I could identify with everything. I overthink everything. I'm always catastrophizing. I can't really sit still for a minute. I'm always on the go. I sort of need to know what's happening. So he was identifying with so many things I'm talking about in the book, would never have described himself as struggling with anxiety, but actually is high. You know, there's a thing called high functioning anxiety where people can work, they can do well, they can perform, they can get on with their life. And they can do that very, very successfully, but inside they're falling apart. And then they normally crash quite quickly. So they're the people who, when they're down or when they're off radar, they're just knackered.
Yeah.
They don't want to see anybody. They don't want to go out. They don't want to socialize. They can't be bothered because all of the energy has gone into high functioning anxiety. And there's a lot of that out there.
You mentioned some of them there, but what patterns do you see that indicate someone might be stuck in an anxiety loop and that others might be able to spot, or they might be able to spot within themselves?
I mean, look, the obvious one, if you break it down, the obvious one is if you're in your head all of the time or a lot of the time.
Just what does that mean? Because I'm conscious, like I said before, some people don't realize that that's not them. That's just their default state.
So if you notice, and you can do that, though, like most people don't know that you can stand back and think, oh, what I would like, let me put it to you in a more simple way that this may bring it alive a bit better. Every talk I do, I'll always start by saying, before I even get into the introduction, I'll get people to stop and say, I want you to do nothing for a second. Just shut your eyes or look at the ground, do whatever you want, but I just want to give you a minute of just nothing. And then the minute happens, and then I'll say, I'm just curious, what happened in the minute? And there will always be somebody who will say, God, I was thinking about everything. And I'll say, do you mind me asking, what were you thinking about? And most people can list about 10, 20 things in that minute they were thinking about. So when I say in their head, it's just thought after thought after thought, planning. What have I got to do next? Did I send that email? What am I having for dinner tonight? Have I booked that flight? I wonder why they haven't texted me back. So if you notice that your head's in overdrive a lot of the time, then it's probably an indicator that there's some degree of anxiety, because we're not meant to be that active all of the time. There's a part in the brain on the right-hand side called the amygdala. It's like a fire alarm. And it's useful if there's real anxiety in front of you, that will go off and it will get you out of the room, or it will get you to a place of safety. But a lot of us are walking around in our everyday life with this alarm intermittently going off when it's not needed. And of course, one way of spotting it will be the overthinking, the overanalyzing, the over-worrying, the over-predicting, the over-catastrophizing. So that's one way you'll spot it. The other way can be with a feeling. So it's really interesting that, and again, I don't want to generalize, but often men, when you say, what are you feeling? Well, they'll be a bit blank. Say, what do you mean about that? So if I'm struggling to get to a feeling, I'll say, when you're worked up or you're struggling, where do you feel it in your body? And then immediately people will say, oh, my stomach or my chest, I feel like I'm being choked, or I just got a really bad headache. So you've got access to the emotion, because of most emotions held in the body. It's that brilliant expression, the body keeps a score. So once I've got to someone in their body and say, all right, okay, so you've got this anxiety, you feel this heaviness in your chest or knots in your stomach. So what I'll do is I'll stay there with them and say, go, what happens when you stay focused on that? And then that will lead to the story. And then what you'll normally get is, God, I'm feeling a bit fearful, or I'm feeling uncertain, or God, I'm feeling a bit sad, or I'm feeling a bit lonely. So you can normally get access to the emotion through what's been held in the body. So there's always, like, I guess as a therapist, you've always got your bag of tricks, really. Whereas if you can't get immediate access to something, you'll always find a way in to working out. So often people have got all of these feelings that they're carrying around, and they don't know what to do with them either. And you know, like, an emotion has a journey to take. I don't want to sound too cliched here, but every emotion has a beginning, middle, and end. And I guess what most people do is so the minute they get an emotion they don't like, people jump out and they're like, fucking hell, I'm not having that. So they try and block the emotion. So the emotion never really gets permission to travel through. But then if you think of what happens, then it's like a pile-up.
Yeah.
So like day on day, no emotions getting through. So it's just all piling up. And then eventually people then say, I'm knackered all the time. I'm overwhelmed. I'm exhausted. I'm burnt out. Not really excited by life anymore. How could you be? You've got all of this stuff backdamming. So I guess part of what Addicted to Anxiety and the other books do is to try and, it's going to sound odd really, but my job is to get people out of their own way.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes 100%.
If I can get the person out of the way, help them to see that they're in the way. First of all, that's the key thing. If I can help them to see that they're in the way, and then say, right, great, now that I've got you on board, what I now need you to do is I need you to step back. And then that's a brilliant part of the work, because, people start to connect and they think, oh, bloody hell, this is what I do. I overinvest in the thinking. I don't deal with any of these emotions. Most behaviors are about trying to not think or feel anything. Drink too much, eat too much, taking too much Coke, spending too much. I mean, it doesn't matter to me what it is. People will just find ways of avoiding either the thoughts or avoiding the emotion, because they think, oh, I don't want to go near this stuff. But of course, the behaviors then create, I mean, how many people do we know struggle because they're drinking too much, or they're using drugs that actually get in the way of their life or their relationships and stuff? So it's kind of like, we see the behaviors as a way of coping and trying to soothe, when actually longer term they just create more and more problems. So my job, I guess, is to help people spot, okay, could this be real for you? Am I making sense to you? And I can't move on until, like, I would be wasting my time if I tried to force someone through. So it's kind of like, do you get it? And I'm always 100% sure when I know they've got it and the coin is dropped.
If you're enjoying this content, you can watch or listen ad-free on the Men's Health app by joining the Men's Health Squad today. Head over to hearstmagazines.co.uk/mh-mag. Once you're in the squad, you'll also have access to tons of exclusive content, including interviews, ad-free videos, and our world-class training platform, which features dozens of training plans to suit every level and any goal. You've worked with lots of people struggling with anxiety, and as you say, you're helping to help them get out of their own way. Let's sort of ground everything we've just spoken about into some sort of actionable stuff. I wonder if you could introduce me to the H.A.R.T method that you talk about in the book.
Can you remind me? Can you break down the acronym for me?
I can.
Every interview I go to, they say, you say on page 64. And I think, what did I say on page 64?
I empathize with you because I love an acronym. And I will come up with them and instantly forget them. Like, I don't actually think they're necessarily, for me, a good tool for remembering things. They're a good tool for conceptualizing, but help, embrace, accept, respond, and trust. So let's start with help.
So we can break them all down. So I guess the first thing is help is the key thing. We are not, none of us are independent. So we'd like to believe we are, but actually, no matter who we are, there are periods when we might need to just step up and say, could do with a bit of help and support, because that is part of the human condition. We're all primarily hardwired to connect, and to need connection and sometimes to need help and support. So that kind of myth that we can manage independently is a myth. So I kind of think there, for me, I hammer on about this all the time. There is like no shame whatsoever in needing help. Actually, it is a strength, because that acknowledgement is kind of what brings you forward to the next stage. The embrace part is about, and it's counterintuitive in some ways, because it's, if we think of anxiety, for example, most people's instinct are to want to ignore that part of them. So I talk a lot about the anxious self. I don't think about anxiety just as a primal mechanism, because it's not like treating a kidney or a lung. When I treat anxiety, I think it's a scared part of you that needs you to work with it. And if you think about how most people work with their anxious self, they either try to beat it down, push it down, run from it, hide it away. When you do that, though, you're abandoning a part of yourself. So when I talk about embracing that part of self, I'm not talking about some, give yourself a kiss in the mirror every day. But what I'm saying is, unapologetically, you don't abandon that part of yourself. You go to that scared little fella or girl or person within you, and you make a decision to start working with them rather than run away from them. What were the other? Remind me of the
Accept.
So acceptance is a hard one, because, mostly we feel that if we accept something, we're giving in, and it's a sign of weakness. Whereas actually the natural order sometimes is to allow life to be as it is. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're in terrible circumstances that you put up with them, or if you're dealing with bad behavior. So acceptance is never about...
It's not complacency.
It's not complacency, or it's not weakness, or it's not giving up. But acceptance is that kind of, sometimes life is what it is, and sometimes the fighting against, or the pushing back, or the resisting life as it is creates a problem, because we start to argue, I wanted it to be, it needed to be, it should be. And that means that it's wrong, when actually, here's a great way of describing this here. If you think of a lake, okay, and if you throw a stone into a lake, okay, you'll immediately get a ripple, okay, and that's exactly what you would expect to happen. And what you know is that the ripple in the lake will settle down. Now, most people, when they get a ripple in their life, of whatever description is, they find it hard to do that. They'll want to jump in the water and rescue it or sort it all out. And of course, what we know is that it will just make it tenfold worse. So the acceptance part is just about knowing, again, when to get out of the way, knowing when to be with, it's okay that you don't have an answer today. It's okay that it's uncertain. It's okay that it's imperfect. It's okay that it didn't go to plan. So there's a brilliant American guy called Michael Singer, and he wrote this book called The Surrender Project. I don't know if you've heard of it. Back in the day, and it's like one of those iconic books, really. But he talks a lot about the importance of surrender and acceptance and getting out of the way. But just differentiating, it doesn't mean giving up or defeat. It means sometimes we have to be courageous enough to stand back and think.
I was going to say, it's actually, I think people struggle. It's a language thing again, isn't it? But actually, it takes an incredible amount of strength to accept things as they are. And actually, you can't really do much. I think as Carl Rogers said, the paradox is, once you accept things, you can actually change them, because accepting is seeing things as they are.
Well, here's the thing that's really interesting for me, and this is again a getting older thing as well, is that I'd say in my kind of early 20s and 30s and stuff, I wholeheartedly believed that I had to control everything, and that things wouldn't happen unless I got involved, or unless I took some active role in doing it. I mean, one of the most liberating things about getting older is that what I'm learning is, and this is the weirdest thing in the planet, is, but the more I step back, like even where, you write a book and you're getting it out there and you're promoting it and you're doing all the things that you need to do to get your work out there. What I've learned is that the more I get out, it doesn't mean that I don't show up and I don't do the work. Of course you do. But the more I've learned to let go and just trust that the right interviews will come, the right moments will come, the right people will come, it will all evolve. When I truly, truly let that go, it just all happens. Where I have seen it before, where I've done stuff and I've got so in my head, or I felt that I needed to take a really tight rein on it, and it just goes the opposite way, because you're going against that sort of natural order.
And there's nothing sort of metaphysical or mystical about that, is there? It just means stop white knuckling your life. Yeah,
and I think natural flow, isn't it? And I'm sure you guys hear athletes and stuff talking about it all the time. that natural flow, is it?
Yeah, that's such an important point. And athletes are an incredible example of people who are so good at this and also so bad at this, because they're a breed of people who completely understand and accept and throw themselves into and enriched by flow states, but on the outside are also massive control freaks and make themselves suffer. And it's so interesting that a lot of people haven't learned to extrapolate that piece they find by just letting things be what they are, which doesn't mean surrender. It just means get out of your own head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is just my own control freak, actually. Yeah. What was it that we should finish the acronym just in case?
No, yeah.
What were the other
Help, embrace, accept, respond. We've accepted it, now how do we respond?
So the respond we've kind of talked about, that is...
Imagine if we just left it there.
Yeah. No, it's just that my own head wouldn't let that go and think, oh, we didn't finish that. So the respond is basically your actions. And that is, it's not expecting someone to come and rescue. It's the willingness to connect. Okay, how am I going to respond to this? How am I reacting to this? How am I dealing with this? Is there an alternative? I often think it's a brilliant thing to do is when you've noticed, and we all have this every day of our lives, don't we? When somebody pushes our button or they do something that has really pissed us off or something hasn't gone to plan or whatever the context might be, and we know there's a big reaction. So inside there's a battleground going on and we plan on what we're going to say and what we're going to do, and the emails are going off and all of that stuff. It happens, it's part of all our lives every day. I think there's something really powerful in recognizing that response and taking responsibility for, okay, am I just reacting from something darker in here?
Yeah.
Or even if you're managing your anxiety, how am I responding to this as opposed to just diving in and doing what you would normally do? Something powerful about checking the response and asking that really simple question, is there an alternative?
Yeah.
Would there be an alternative way of managing this that might work better for me? And just like that snippet, I use it I use it regularly every day rather than just jump in. Okay, is there a more helpful alternative?
Yeah.
And it's that's game changing.
Yeah. Yeah.
In some situations.
Skillful is the word I use. Is this going to be a very skillful action or am I just, and the more I feel, the longer I wait. As if it's coming, I'm shaking.
Yeah, you feel it. Yeah.
Maybe this isn't coming from the most skillful place right now.
Well, most of our big reactions are never, and this is true, most of them are never ever about what's going on in that moment. If you really upset me today or you really piss me off, you can be guaranteed that it actually has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
You've reminded me of something, or you've got to me, or you've triggered something old in me that I've suddenly decided to act out on here and now.
Or our capacity to tolerate it is just low, right? Because of a billion other circumstances. Yeah. Trust after respond. Trust.
This is the hardest thing, isn't it, really, for all of us, really, is about, and I think for me, the biggest thing here is not necessarily trusting in life, even though that's important, it's trust in self. Most people don't really trust that they will cope, they will manage, that they have enough resources, that they have it within them to deal with this. And actually, this is one of the most incredible things about my job that I love, actually, is that you see people at the beginning and they really are lacking trust in themselves. They come in and they're full of doubts and questions and they're giving themselves a hard time and they're questioning this and not really trusting any aspect of who they are. And I think a lot of the work in this book is about learning to trust that you will cope, you will manage, you have got the resources, that whatever you've got in there is enough.
Yeah.
And I know that it's among the top hated cliches, including for me, that you are enough. But actually, many people do walk around just feeling that they're substandard or below par in some way. And I think that when you kind of start trusting, actually, I'm okay. Or as it's say in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and they'd say, I'm dead on, have this expression. And when you kind of get to that point, you think, actually, this is all right. I'm good as I am. It doesn't need to be something else. That's a great place. I said to somebody the other day, I'm a big advocate of contentment.
Yeah.
I think it's largely underrated.
I think that's got to be the biggest goal, right?
But when do you ever see that on Instagram?
No.
Or as we're all talking about being richer or happier or successful.
Even happier, I think, is a malignant.
I should tell you, my book, 10 Times Happier, should never have been called that. I had a different title for that, which I can't say, but that wasn't ever meant to, that book shouldn't have been that title, because I didn't want it to be that title, and it just evolved as that in a process of discussions. But I do believe that personally for me, what I strive for in my life every day is contentment.
Yeah.
If I have that, the other stuff doesn't matter as much, because it'll all be fine. It'll all work out. I don't think we talk enough about striving for contentment. It's a pretty decent road to take.
I think it's the most underrated goal, contentment, peace. And I think people can recognize it because they recognize times in their life when they feel very content, and all of the things that they thought they wanted, they thought they would prioritize that mattered to them, suddenly, that's all good. Like you say, like, I'm fine.
But even if you can find it, even if we take the condition away that, oh, I'm really content, I've got, the job's good, the relationship's good, like my car, life is behaving well at the moment. It's kind of taking it the other direction too. If that isn't the case, and there are challenges and there are difficulties and things are not going smoothly, and there's obstructions and a bit of turbulence in the background, it's like, oh, okay, God, I wonder, can I be content in all of this as well? That's a bigger challenge. And I think, if you can find that, there's no good or bad or right or wrong, that all of it can be, all right, okay, what would it be to challenge myself to try and be as contented as I can be in the midst of all of this? I mean, that's a largely underrepresented and underrated skill that we don't talk about enough.
Let's talk about it then. How do we do it? How do we find contentment amidst life's discontent?
I think it's a tough one. I think it's about making that decision. Like if you were asking me that question individually, I'd say, okay, tell me what you've tried. What have you tried to bring you contentment in your life? I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if I did ask you that, I'd put money that you'd probably say over the years, well, I've tried this, tried that. And then my question would be, did they work? And I'd guarantee you'd say, yeah, for a while, or not quite, because I still feel this gnawing sense of unease or discontentment, or just not feeling satisfied with my life. So for most people, it's like, just ask yourself that question. All of the things that you've done to try and make you content, have they worked? And most people I know listening to the podcast will answer, actually, no, they haven't. Okay, well, that gives you a really important piece of information. You're going in the wrong direction.
And then?
Well, most people, the direction is the external. It's about getting, achieving, wanting, desiring. It's all of those stuff that we go for, where actually it's often for me, I guess I saw this come alive in 10 years working with people who were dying. It comes alive in the, being with life as it is, simplicity, good relationships, the right people around you, appreciating what life has given you, being just here. Like, it's not about what's coming next. It's just about, okay, today's enough. So it comes back to these kind of more Buddhist, Zen, mindful, again, I know it sounds incredibly cliched, but, if you can just be where today really as much as possible, and, value what you've got, and keep it simpler. I mean, I think that is the key thing. We all screw up at times by just making things way too difficult and complicated. And we're all guilty of that. Just like, what would it be like to simplify this a bit? So what I'd say, go inward, be a bit more present, and keep it simple.
Nice. You talk about grounding techniques and breathing exercises in the book. Can you share some simple but effective practices to help people be here?
I mean, I think again, this is one of the most underrated. I think you can teach people breathing, and I think breath work's really powerful. It can put a lot of people off because it feels a bit too yoga, or it feels a bit too, I don't know, a bit too self-helpy. And I've discovered that over the years, that you go in with a really well-intended breathing technique and you see the eye rolls, you think, oh shit, not somebody else telling me to breathe. Like I didn't know that I have to breathe. So I'm not going to go over a breathing technique, even though they're incredibly powerful. If you're using any of the Wim Hof stuff or the 4, 5, 8 techniques, I mean, you've heard of all of these, but they're useful, so please do use them. I think if you want to quieten the mind quickly, and you need to quieten the mind quickly, a powerful thing to do is that repetition of a mantra or a phrase, because it has the same impact as breath work or meditation, in that the minute you bring the mind to a simple point of focus. So if you consider that most people's minds are on overdrive, and they've got thousands of things going on in any given, there's not in any given moment, but over a span of an hour, there's just a lot of activity. that's sort of just repeating a simple phrase. It could be, I am calm, I can cope. I am calm, I can cope. We know that just repeating that phrase over and over and over again, even for a couple of minutes, creates a healthy distraction for the mind, so that instead of getting caught up in the narrative and the detail of the thought, you're bringing attention away to a single point of focus, which is just repeating the phrase over and over and over again. So what you do is you immediately quieten the activity in the mind. You quieten the noise, you quieten the cognitive activity, you quieten the volume of thought. And that can be an incredibly useful thing to do. If you just need to quieten and you need to steady quickly, instead of getting over involved in the mind's content, what you do is, okay, I'm just going to repeat this over and over and over. And every time I get distracted and the thought comes in, I then come back to the repetition. I repeat, and then I get distracted again and I come back. So I won't get into the neuroscience too much, but I mean, you're increasing neuroplasticity when you do that. So essentially what you're doing is you're creating a more flexible mind. If that doesn't work for you, I mean, another thing is to, if you are feeling particularly worked up, it's always incredible to come back to the here and now. Okay, what can I taste in my mouth at the minute? What can I smell? What can I touch? What can I hear? What can I see? So those sort of immediately grounding things just bring you back into the room. Another thing that I talked about in the first book, there's a technique called bilateral stimulation. Some people describe it as tapping, but it's this kind of slow tap. You can be used in the upper arms, or if you don't want to be sat on a train doing that and looking silly, you can do it in your thighs, left to right, or just tapping your feet left to right. And we know that slow bilateral tap can be really useful, again, for reducing cognitive activity. But what you're always trying to do is you're trying to create that left-right brain balance. And we know that's why when you go for a walk, just that mechanism of left-right can just actually slow people down and help them feel more centered. So they're the kind of rather than get into kind of clever techniques and fancy neuroscientific, they're the ones that I think of can work really quickly and effectively. But I think what I would say to anybody who's interested in techniques, and one of the key things I talk about in Addicted to Anxiety, the key thing for me is you can be taught 100 techniques, right? But if you're still being an arsehole to yourself, the techniques don't matter. So for me, probably the most important techniques is, genuinely, if you start talking to yourself and treating yourself as somebody who matters, you're halfway there. So don't get too caught up in the breathing and the yoga and the meditation and the climbing up a mountain. Just start simply first. Try and get that part right. Just start trying to talk to yourself, treating yourself as somebody who matters. And that's a really good, solid foundation. Then you can work with that. Whereas I see a lot of the stuff online goes the other way.
Yeah.
And doesn't even address that. Like, it doesn't matter. And I think, well, why would we ignore the fundamental? Like, that's the basic foundation.
Yeah.
And techniques often don't work because they're not built on a foundation.
Yeah.
They're just built on sand. They're just cliches or just kind of notional tips that don't really serve any benefit.
Yeah, and also there's this, any sort of negative affective state, but let's say depression is an Ouroboros, right? Like, it eats itself in that if you're treating yourself like an arsehole, you're probably not going to be in the frame of mind to do anything to help yourself, which is I think is the problem with the over-prescription of sort of those nice platitudes, is they don't tend to land with the people who actually need them the most, because the people who need them the most are cynical. They don't have faith in themselves to treat themselves well enough. Whereas actually just these small ones, like, just take yourself for a walk. Like, everyone's worth a walk.
A big good book, wouldn't it? Stop being an arsehole.
Stop being an arsehole. Yeah, stop being an arsehole to yourself. But it's the foundation, right?
I'm joking about it, but actually, honestly, I can't say seriously enough how, like, I mean, in my career, I sat in front of literally thousands of people, and what would I say is the common denominator with all of them? That would be it at the beginning.
Yeah.
How they're treating themselves and how they talk to themselves. I mean, that is a given. It doesn't matter who they are, what they do, what the background is. That's what they're doing in abundance.
Yeah.
And that's what's creating a lot of the difficulty.
We just touched a little bit on walking there and some physical practices, but wouldn't be men's health if I didn't ask, what part does exercise and just physicality, movement play in I don't want to say alleviating symptoms of depression, but moving us towards that wholeness, that contentment.
Yeah, I mean, look, though, the whole thing about this, Ian, is that it's never just about the kind of the mental health conversation's never just about talking. It's a very active process, and it should be, it should be. All of this today is about action. It's not just about the knowing and the awareness, it's about the actions you take. Every study out there tells us that, no matter, movement is good for you. Whatever you're able to do, move. Because not only will you feel better, but actually from my point of view, I argue exercise is important is because you can process. The actual act of getting out and moving means that actually you're actually helping process material. So for me, that's a given. It's like, no, why wouldn't you do that? It's a really useful thing. But also chemically, it's helpful as well. That we know that if you're anxious, particularly, and you've got a buildup of cortisol and adrenaline, we know that just getting out, even if it's a 10-minute brisk walk, can help reduce your cortisol levels. And of course, that's going to chemically help you feel more regulated. But even outside of that, I'm really interested in the whole connection between gut and mental health as well. As I mean, you mentioned depression there earlier. I mean, 90% of serotonin is created in the gut. But we always talk about depression, for example, as a mind disease, when actually, why aren't we talking more about the fact that this does not only just about exercise, but about the foods that we put in to your bodies, because they are related and they link. Anxiety in itself, I believe wholeheartedly, is an inflammatory condition. We don't talk enough about the fact that an inflamed brain is an anxious brain. Yet when we eat high fat foods, when we eat, lots of sugars, complex carbs, not the complex carbs, the simple carbs that, that just kind of evaporate quickly, we contribute to inflammation in the body. So, all of the research is pointing more and more and more. We can't really just treat this in isolation. Better mental well-being. Of course, it's about all the things you and I have talked about today, but of course, it's about exercise. It's about the foods that you put into your body. It's about the decisions you make in your life. It's about the people that you have in your life. It's about the boundaries. It's about how you're dealing with what life's presenting to you. So I get annoyed when I see mental health just presented as this kind of blanket, simple, this is what you need to do. Actually, it's not. It's a complete, all of this stuff is a complete overhaul of your life and a willingness to kind of think, all right, well, my deal with every client is that when they come in, so, there's always a bit of resistance, and people might be listening to some of this today and they might have their own degree of resistance and think, oh, I'm not sure about that. And that's all well and good for him and all of that stuff. And I get it. But my question to everyone I work with is, okay, is your model working for you? Whatever you're doing with your life at the minute, however you're managing the mind, however you're eating, however you're exercising, whatever you're doing in your life, is it working for you? And of course, every single time they say no, well, it's okay. Well, are you willing to at least be open to the fact that there might be alternatives here that could work better? And if they go with that, then good. I can work with that. And you rarely have anyone that says no to that. So if there's a willingness to be curious about other options and other ways, then that's a really good place. So what I'd say to anybody listening today who might be a bit cynical and saying, oh, here's some therapist banging on, what I'd say is I'd encourage you to at least step back and say, okay, can I be curious about some of what he's talking about? And if you can, then great, because you can work with that.
Yeah. I think for me, like what really nails it is that line you just said, that kind of, how's that working out for you?
Yeah.
How's that working out for you? And
it never is working out terribly well.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that I'm right. It's not about me being right or the therapist being right. It's none of that. It's just about, can you trust my experience of seeing thousands, hundreds of thousands. I've been around 30 years now in physical and mental health doing this work. You really do get a flavor of what works and what doesn't work at this stage of the game. So I just kind of think, well, are you willing to listen to some of this? Because there might be a bit of value in this for you.
If listeners could take away just one key message from the book, what would you want it to be?
That treat anxiety as an enemy, and that's what it becomes.
Very nice. Nice. Well, thank you very much for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me. It's been
an
great.
incredible chat.
Thank you.